All right. Hello, everybody. We're going to do number 5. We're going back to the basics still, and we're going to talk networks. The last couple of slide decks are really focused on kind of an introduction to the career field, followed by 4 slide decks going into, or 3 slide decks going into DNS and kind of how DNS works in the way that's really important to us as intelligence and cybersecurity professionals, if I can talk. There's a lot of ways to talk about those aspects, but obviously as someone in intelligence or cybersecurity, we care about different things than someone who is a technical engineer who are trying to make those things function. They kind of have a different focus. We care about a few of the same things, but a lot of different things. So, and the same thing applies as I lead into this for networks. There's a lot of things about networks that if you were a network engineer or someone who's trying to build a network and diagnose it and figure out problems and so forth, you would care about vastly different things than what we're going to talk about today. But there's some crossover, and you'll see why as we go through it. Hopefully, if you've started to create your analyst hat, I want you to put it on now, because it's going to be important to look at these things as we talk through them with that concept in mind of, if I was an attacker, how would I take advantage of this? And if I'm a defender, how can I prevent the attacker from taking advantage of it and keep my users from fouling up the whole thing? So with no further ado, let's talk about my horribly rastered graphic here. I didn't realize it would look like that, but that's okay. We're not here for the splashy graphics. That's not my strength. But I do want to talk about networks. And a network is very simply 2 or more things tied together in a way that they can share. It says it more nicely there in the first bullet. And the second one talks very specifically about a computer network, which is probably obvious to everyone that that's when you have 2 or more computers kind of networked together, working together to share resources, pass information on, and so forth. So it's kind of important to set the stage there, because when we start talking networks, I'm going to refer to anything where I say network as a computer network unless I tell you otherwise. All right. More fancy graphics. Okay. If you recall last slide deck, we talked about how the internet had to go through a router to get to something on the other side of the router. Now, in this sense of a network, a computer network, that's what fits in my reversed question mark. All the different things that you can put over there. And I'm going to ask you some questions on what you think would be over there. But before we do so, it's key to remember what a router does. So as a kind of on-the-spot question, would one of you tell me what a router does?
The router connects you to the internet. It routes you to the internet.
It does, indeed. It is your connection to the internet. If you recall in the previous presentations, when you get an IP address, that is your presence on the internet, because the internet, loosely defined, uses IPs to equate to computers. And there's a lot more details there that we'll touch on later when we dig back into DNS. But for now, your router, its connection to the internet, it can be thought of as an IP address. So your router has an IP address that belongs just to it. But because it routes, it can give other people behind it that it's taking care of for internet access IPs as well. In fact, you've probably seen this in your home router, and you've seen the 192.168.1. something or .0. something IP address at your home. Because if you're like a regular person, you have 10, maybe 20 devices on your home router. Now that leads me to talk just briefly about IP addresses. Just as a note, there are different versions. And previously we talked about there being an IP version 4 and an IP version 6. You can use both. There's nothing wrong with using one over the other. Version 6 is indeed an enhancement. However, it has not been widely adopted. Some do use it, some don't. Why might you think we changed versions? Would anybody want to speculate on why we might have changed from IP version 4 to IPv6?
We ran out of options, numbers.
We did. There was back when they originally conceived of the internet, which wasn't that long ago, honestly. They thought that having a couple million IP addresses would be more than sufficient. They never thought that we would exhaust those. That's why they carved up the world and gave each region of the world so many IP addresses. So the United States had so many, Bulgaria had so many, Hungary has so many, Russia has so many, and so on. Poland has so many. And they thought, well, if we do this, it'll be enough. However, as the internet matured and we did more things with it, they rapidly realized that they exhausted them all. One of the things they did to make that go a little farther, kind of like how, I don't have enough to eat that last week of the month, so I'm going to kind of stretch things out and maybe add in a few things I don't necessarily like, but will tide me over. We kind of did the same thing with IP addresses. And we created something called network address translation and a few other technologies like it, NAT for short, that allowed us to take a few collectives of IP addresses like that 192.168.1. whatever, that chunk of IP addresses, and say that's reserved. And everybody who has a router can use those. And we're going to let all the internal IP addresses, all the devices that connect to a router at home use kind of this NATed interface. So everybody has a 192.168.1.1 kind of device in their network. But when it goes to the internet, it's going to use the router's IP address. So remember that the router has its own IP address that represents its connection to the internet. But past it, where the question mark is here on my slide deck, there are dozens, possibly hundreds of IPs that are never expected to go on the internet. Is that clear? Is there any questions?
That would be like your phone or smart TV or something like that.
Your smart TV, definitely. Your phone would be slightly different because your phone usually has a dual connection going on. It's connected to a cell network, and frequently we connect it to our Wi-Fi at home through a wireless interface. And so it has a dual connection. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit and how that's interesting from a security perspective. Because when you have something that's connected to two different networks, it creates a bridge. And when you have a bridge, things can cross back and forth.
Artifact.
That is indeed an artifact. If you've ever looked at your phone and looked at your past Wi-Fi connections, or you looked at your laptop and looked at your past Wi-Fi connections, you probably find a list of things that you connected to in the past, including the passwords that you used to get in. So different topic, but very interesting one. What I want you to remember is, like, everybody's router at home and in a business has a bunch of NATed addresses, network address translation addresses behind them that are non-routable on the internet. So if you announce them through the router, that 192.168.1.1 or its equivalent out on the internet, it would not go anywhere. The ASs, the asynchronous systems, and the border gateway protocol routing tables would not recognize it and go, we don't know what to do with you, and you would not go anywhere. And there's a couple ranges of IPs that are set that way on purpose, because like the times where we didn't have enough to eat and we had to stretch things, we were doing the same thing with our IP version 4 addresses, which probably begs the question of why didn't we all just move to IPv6, right? Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Because everything was already set up on 4.
Yes. We had what we call sunk cost in IPv4, where shifting it wholesale to IPv6 would have cost so much money, no one was going to do that. So it has been an incredibly painfully slow transition. And many folks are bridging IPv4 and IPv6 with their DNS. They have both. Especially since right now there's not really an additional cost to have both addresses assigned. So keep that in mind. If you, for some, you mentioned TV and things like that. So think about what a router does. That core thing about routing is really important to keep in mind, because a router's job is not only to connect you to the internet, but to route information from everything on the left side of our router here to the internet and then get that information back to the right thing on the left side of the internet. So if your smart TV calls out to see if it has an update, the router has to remember that the TV, that device asked for information, get it to the internet, find that information, and then route it back to that device and not your phone or your iPad or your smart, appliance, whatever it might be, your Alexa or whatever you have in your house. And that's really important because not all devices can do that. And that's really something to think about here. But before I go there, it was good that you brought up cell networks. So I've got this little tower, that's my cell network. Your router can connect to a cellular service if it's built to do so. And usually those are wireless access points, and they have the little antennae. Some have one, most have two, and that's so that it can get a wireless signal. Because if you're not getting a wireless signal, what kind of signal are you getting? Don't speak at once.
A wired signal.
Wired, right? So there's a framework of analysis called course of action analysis. And it's also tree analysis and a couple other names. One of the things you do is you try to iterate through all the possibilities at a singular point. So on my router here, what are my options? I either have a cabled connection to the internet or I have a wireless connection to the internet. Is there another option that might exist? Please don't just say no, think about it and give me an appropriate response.
If it's not through a wire and it's not wireless, it wouldn't be able to connect.
Pretty much. I mean, are there any other options? Can you think of anything else that might happen? If I can figure out how to click the chat here. So no matter what, if it comes through, when it comes to this thing, the key thing I want you to remember is there's either a wired or a wireless connection at play when you're using a routing network like this. You're not going to have a sudden connection in some way that you don't understand, right? They're not going to gain some kind of in-between wire and wireless kind of connection, right? It's not going to flow through the air, because if it flows through the air, it's wireless, right? Doesn't matter if it's near infrared or it's Bluetooth. Those are ways to describe a particular wireless technology.
Satellite.
Satellite is wireless though.
Right.
Right. Someone in the chat has mentioned that you could connect to a wireless network interface card from a mobile provider. That is correct, but eventually it will either be a wireless or a wired connection. You're either going to plug into your phone or you're going to connect it and make it a bridge for a wireless connection. You're just putting a device in the middle. Ultimately, to get to the internet, it has to be one of these two. Why do you think that's important?
So that we can look for the pathways that somebody might gain access to our computer or.
Sure, absolutely. So let's say that in our course of action analysis, we've looked at all the possibilities, how somebody could get to the router and have a connection. And we find 50 of them related to cabled and 5 related to wireless. And then you find clues, you find artifacts that indicate that it was a wireless connection. What did we just eliminate?
That it was any of those wired connections.
We could then eliminate 50 of those possibilities and isolate it down to 5. And that's huge. Now you don't have to look through 55 different possibilities. So finding narrowed points in a diagram of possibilities allows you to understand where to scope and scope down a problem. So if I'm looking at a situation where, well, actually, I don't want to get ahead of myself. We talk about malware and stuff like that later in the slide deck, but this really comes into play when you have something occur in your network and you're trying to diagnose and troubleshoot where it started. Kind of like when COVID happened, they were always looking for the very first location where it spread from. Patient 0. If you've ever played any of the plague games and stuff like that, you always have a patient 0, right? And if you can, the closer you are to patient 0, the faster you can stem an infection And in the cyber world, if you can identify where something came in at, you're closer to how they gained entrance than in any other way. And that can be incredibly helpful. Okay, enough of that. But just remember, when it comes to this, you really only have two options. All right. See if I can click this. There we go. Oh, I meant to ask you what was on the other side. All right, pretend, well, there's no point. So here's some examples of things that are on the other side of that router. You might have laptops, you might have another access point, you might have even another router. I have several routers in my house, and I use them to partition off or to have more things kind of routing for me. You have phones, servers, projectors, and so on. It's kind of a big, beefy amount of possibilities there.
Smart fridges.
Yeah, you can have a smart fridge, smart toaster, that kind of thing. If you have kids, you have smart kids that are smartly being smart on their devices. So we already touched this. I kind of got out of sequence here, but even connecting to the router, it's cabled and wireless, but past the router, it's also the same situation. You're either connecting by cable or you have a wireless connection. So that's my core router, that big router on the right. And from it inside of my network, like think about your house right now. Where is your router at in your house? For me, it's in my office. My primary router for the house is in my office, and I have a secondary router in my office as well for all my other equipment. But you probably have a different situation potentially.
Right, and some things are plugged directly into it. Like ours is right next to our TV, so it can just easily plug into the TV.
Sure.
And then a lot of our devices, especially like in our rooms and stuff, are connected wirelessly.
Okay, so let's talk about that for a second. How many things can you physically plug into your router at home?
I think I've got 5 ports on my router.
You got 5 ports, right? You need one of them for the connection from your ISP. So click. Now you got 4. Now, obviously, they're bigger routers. It's easily you in enterprises, you get any server room and they'll have 64 ports or more. I don't know if anybody's seen a bigger one. I think 64 is kind of the largest amount of ports I've really seen on a server rack for a router. And they're big. But let's say I'm a company with 5,000 people. I at least have 5,000 devices, right? I can't cable everything to my one router. So it should make sense that there's going to be other things you're going to need to do, right? You need more devices, either more routers or something else that can help you route and move traffic through your network. Now, semi-trick question, but not really. How many devices can you connect to a wireless router? One that's giving you a Wi-Fi connection.
As many as it can handle without slowing down, or even with slowing down.
Okay, fair. There is kind of a hard limit. Somebody else?
100. Oh, I'm sorry. That's stupid.
Well, just a random number.
Yeah.
So the router is giving you a non-routable IP, right, to use that 192.168 or its equivalent. There's a couple of these. You can't just mix and match. So if you're on a 192.168.x.x kind of network, you're on that kind of network. And that right there gives you the answer of how many potentially you could do, right? You have to declare a pool when you set up your router. And you're like, okay, I'm going to create a pool of IP addresses and I'm going to put 100 in there. And out of the gate, a lot of the ISPs, when they give you a router for your own use, they'll put 50 to 100. So you're not incorrect in pulling out a 100 number. It's a nice, easy round number. But you could easily have hundreds. But the more you have to route, the slower your router becomes. Right? Because you're putting a lot of taxing on it. Because it probably is no surprise, but when you're not using your phone or you're not using your computer, it's still doing things, right? It's still busy doing all the things it can't do when you're using it. Which means if you have a teenager, it gets like a very tiny amount of time, very small amount of time in which to do stuff because it's like attached to them. So keep that in mind. Because that limitation is why we have different devices besides a router to kind of handle how network traffic works. And we're going to talk about a couple of them here. Well, my transition didn't work, but it's all right. We already did the how many as far as how many can connect. Get ahead of myself here. There's my transition. Here's the fun thing. All right, so let's talk about a switch. So if a router routes, what's a switch do?
Gonna say it directs.
It kind of directs traffic. So if I want you to think about this. I'm not going to put a hub up here, but the hub is kind of the smallest part of this. A hub is a five-way stop with stop signs and a lot of traffic. And if you've ever been at a 4 or 5-way stop, everybody pulls up and nobody knows who's supposed to go first. People are like pulling out and other people are pulling out at the same time. And you have collisions and you have near misses, and then you turn and you're like, am I supposed to take the third left? I see this in traffic circles too, where people are going around the circle and they're like, is it the third one, the fourth one? Right? That's what a hub is like. Everything kind of goes into this big queue and gets stuck. And sometimes it misses and it doesn't keep track of where it came from. And it's not very good about knowing where it's going, because it gets into the circle and it's like, hey, where am I supposed to go? And it hopes that, it'll get an answer. That's why hubs aren't very efficient, right? You might use them at home, but you don't want to use them all the time. A switch is a little better. It actually has a switching system where it's like, oh, you came off of the first road and you exited out the third road. And when you come back from the third road, it's like, you need to go to the first road. It knows that much. It doesn't know anything else. Like, it can't help you with things like, it won't give you an IP or anything like that. It just knows how to direct you different directions. You came from there, you're going there. You came from there, you're coming back to where you came from. And so it's a little more efficient. Now, some of them, depending on which types you buy, there are many variations. Some are smart. Some have routing enabled in them. Some are at different layers of DNS, which we'll talk about here soon. And some have additional functions. I want you to think about all of these devices, whether it's a hub, switch, router, or anything else. You can put an you can put an adjective or an adverb in the front of them and make them something else. A good example would be next generation. You have a next generation firewall. You have a next generation router, right? You have an intelligent whatever. They're just saying that they've added capability. And you should look at them carefully, because sometimes adding things makes them slower. So a switch can kind of direct. A router is something else that you can have, because you might want to route more than once, right? Let's say you want to be very particular about a couple computers and you want them only to be able to want them accessible to the rest of your network, but not the internet. You might then put all those computers behind a router for that purpose. Otherwise, you might throw everything on a switch and connect the one switch with 64 ports to the one port on your router. And if you think about that, 64, and you have 64 ports on your one core router, you could get a lot of computers taken care of. I almost forgot wireless router. A wireless router is that component we talked about. A regular plug-in router, it has no wireless piece to it, but a wireless router allows for cabled and wireless kind of connectivity. And you'll notice I don't have it at the far right, because typically your core router for an enterprise especially is not a wireless router. Let's do a little more complicated scenario. As I was saying, let's say this is my router with 64 ports. I have a bunch of computers. I'm going to get a switch with, 24 ports. So now I can cable one cable to my 24 port switch into my router. And now I can take care of 23 other machines. And so I've got a couple. I don't have that many. I've only got 12, but I've got 12 desktops and 2 laptops, all connected to my switch, which is connected to my router. Very simple. And I boxed them because those 10 are kind of in their own little box. Pretty easy.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, pretty straightforward, right? We're doing very, very basic stuff. It gets complicated when you add in cloud infrastructure and you're got partially existing in data centers and a bunch of other stuff that makes life hard, but can be more secure and cheaper. Before I go farther, this is kind of a very mildly complex network. I want to talk about one key component. It's more than just connecting a bunch of computers and devices to routers and switches and things of that nature. To really have a computer network come together, you need to create what they call a domain. And for every domain you create, there's going to be a domain controller. That's going to be one server that kind of handles very specific things like the architecture, the user groups, like who can access it, what groups they are part of, pardon me, and logins. And so if you work for a company, they're going to have your company name dot something, and then they're going to have a local domain that might be the company name dot local. And that's going to be controlled by that one domain controller. And that's the brain of your network. Its job is to say, everybody has to bind to my domain and follow my rules, which means each one of you has to be somebody I know, or I'm not going to let you in. And I have to know what you have access to, because I'm going to control that. That's the whole point of having a domain controller. And you can think about this right now from a attacker's perspective, because the best place for them to get an entrenchment, for them to take over, is a domain controller, because it's the what?
Command center.
Yes, it's the brain. It's the thing. All right. And it handles all kinds of, not only, when I say architecture, think about the fact that it controls how things get patched, moves, it has its own processes that check to see if updates need to happen. It has all these things where it's touching every machine. So if you own the domain controller, you can own basically anything it touches, which is pretty much everything in the domain, which is why it's one of the most sought after things to get to as an attacker. All right, let's do a slightly more complicated network. Again, we have our router. Now we have a switch. I have my same 12 computers, but I have 2 servers that I want to be very specific. And like the scenario I mentioned earlier, I only want these 2 servers to talk to my network. And so that router's job here, this router's job, should put a number on it, is to only allow internal traffic, which means if it's not internal to my network, I don't let it come to these 2 servers. And you may have other rules or logic necessary, but that's one of the core things you might do. And when you do that kind of thing, you're considered to segment off part of your network, break it away and say it's handled by its own router. It has its own requirements and restrictions. And you'll hear, as a security measure, we frequently will tell people, please segment your network. And there's really good reasons why. Could somebody potentially provide one before I cover it? Why we might want to segment our network?
To keep backups separate so that they're not messed with.
Okay, it's not a bad answer. Not a bad answer at all. Anybody else?
Maybe inside company specific information.
Okay, that's what you might preserve there. Sure. Let me ask you this. If I didn't have this router and we were all part of the same local domain, could this computer right here see this laptop?
Yeah.
Okay. If this router was not there, could this computer see this server then?
If that router wasn't there.
Yes. Which means we have a flat, what they call flat network. Everything can see everything else. So if I'm an attacker and I landed on this computer, I could see all the computers in this domain because they're all visible to me. Nothing is keeping them safe or separate. But if I segment off, all I see then is everything. But when I hit this router, I have no idea what's behind it because it rejects me. It's not nice. It doesn't love me.
Oh,
Oh,
And you can do a lot of other things beyond that. That's just the basic measures. There were some points made about setting up traffic control and rule lists and how to separate devices, save bandwidth. All those are correct. But from a security perspective, which is the I here, and an intelligence perspective, I'm looking at where core things need to be put in order to restrict and guide access. That goes right back to that traffic control piece that was commented on. That's very, very important. And that's one of the reasons why I might have this here. Of course, I might segment off different parts of my network to take advantage of multiple routers that go to the internet. Maybe I have multiple buildings and they're cabled together, but I want one to use one internet connection and another one to use a second one. So I'm going to keep them together, but I'm going to separate how they get to the internet, right? There's a lot of reasons why you might engineer your network a certain way. The worst ones are when they just grow wildly, which sadly is the majority. They just kind of blossom and get created. Let's do
The worst
something.
ones. Oh, sorry.
No, go
From
ahead.
our perspective, anyways, is
Yes.
probably really enticing networks from an attacker's perspective, because there's no way that they could have thought of everything while they were growing so haphazardly.
That's correct. And it's a common thing. Like, I think if you looked around your house right now, you would probably not really have a ready list of all the computers on your own router. You would not know
Fair.
the network. You don't know how many guests you've given your Wi-Fi password to, and they could be out in the hallway connected to your network. You have no idea unless you looked at your router. That's why we have tools that kind of monitor that stuff and help us understand that. But there's ways to kind of elude them, and there's things that they don't see. And there's a lot of parts to that. When we get into the risk and threat analysis frameworks, we talk about how risk decisions get made at both strategic and tactical levels. That's kind of a 20s, 30s kind of slide deck from a way from now, but then you'll see why some decisions that seem nonsensical to us get made. And some things will be hopefully more illuminating, but more on that later. We got to cover fundamentals first. Let's move on. Let's make it even more complex. Let's get more crap on the slide.
Ooh.
Ooh.
I had a few more things in here. So we got our core router right here. We're still in a tiny network. We're not big at all. We got a proxy now. What's a proxy do in general? What does a proxy for you do?
Is a substitute.
It's a substitute. Yeah. So if I say, hey, you're my proxy, you're someone who can do something on my behalf. You have my permission. So in this case, if you follow the arrows, the proxy is between the internet and the switch, which means any traffic flow has to go through the proxy both directions. And you do that when you want to kind of watch your network traffic. And also, if you see any traffic flow out of your network that isn't using your proxy, you can flag it. Because there are ways to go around the proxy. It's set on every endpoint device through policy typically, but you can do it manually as well to use a proxy. And of course, you can change it. So, but let's follow this. Core router, we have a proxy. And then we have this switch, which has another router connected to it with two servers. So we've isolated these off on its own little leg. We've got another router that's protecting our domain controller. So we're on a domain. All these things can connect to each other, but the printer can't see anything but the routers and the proxy. But this laptop could print. See? So the printers are accessible, still protected, right? But if you got on a printer, you'd run into a router pretty quickly. Not to move everything around. And this is a wireless access point, of which it has 3 laptops, an iPad, and 2 phones. There's our printer network. I'm sorry, here's our printers in a nice stack. Then we have these computers. And like I was talking about with the building, these 5 are all separated on their own legs. So depending on how the traffic control and pieces were set, these might be able to see each other or they might not. But it is a bit more complex network. And again, this is a very tiny network. It's not complex at all in comparison to reality, but it does help illustrate the point. So let's talk about that situation where you have a cell phone. I've got a nice little orange thing here. So here, these phones are connected to a cell network, and they're also connected to my network. Now, because it's a cell phone wireless connection, they could access the internet and not go through my proxy and not go through my router and bring something back that could come into my network. So they represent a routing or logical risk to me. Any questions on that? You see why that's happening?
Right, that's the bridge you were talking about.
That's the bridge. They've created a bridge with their wireless connection because it is outside of my control. So you could pull the internet up, go to your browser, download a piece of malware accidentally to your phone, and still be connected to my Wi-Fi, and it could move from the phone and bridge into the network, and then it would be on this segment. And it could see anything else connected to the wireless access point. Now, unless it got past the wireless access point or took it over, it would stop there in a kind of a naive view of, basic view of things. And then it beaconed out and couldn't use my cell network. It would try to beacon past this router, hopefully hit my proxy, and then I would see it and shut that sucker down. That's when you get kicked off my network all of a sudden. Or if you have mobile device management software on that particular phone, then you can brick their phone or lock them down. And some businesses will do that. They'll insist if you use their email or if you access their network with your device, that you allow them to have mobile device management software installed for that reason. In case, you bring malware in or you take information out. But majority of enterprises don't do that as well as they probably should. So this is a way for an insider, a malicious insider, to actually exfiltrate data. Okay, so more complex questions. With well, I'll keep going then. With segmentation in order, even if I got on this phone and was able to leap around maliciously and move around laterally into these other machines, I'm pretty much going to get stuck here until I figure out a way to take over something else in the network to move past it. This is why creating a segment can be very effective. It keeps the visibility of someone and the potential for expansion limited. Now, remember, the domain controller talks to everything. And so if you somehow infected its domain process, then you could go through the whole network, which is why they say if you get domain admin or you take over it and get free, then yes, you get everything. That's why you protect this so diligently. All right, let's do something else. How about we have a little malware show up? Boom, malware gets on this computer. Again, what can it see? How far can it see?
The other computers that are connected to that router.
So it sees these other 4 computers, feasibly could move there. But also, what happens? So let's say I'm the guy who infected this machine. So you go to my crazy website. My crazy website, you download some cool software, and that cool software gives you some malware. Right? It's like the date you have that never seems to go away. So you've got this kind of infection here. Now, as the attacker, when this connects back to me, right? So it infects here. A key part of malware that we haven't really gone into, but you need to remember, this goes to one of those things, that logical framework of what must exist, what must happen. When malware lands on a machine, it does not know what your network looks like. It doesn't have this handy diagram. So it has to figure that out. But before it does that, it always phones home. It's like ET. It's got to phone home. Now, there are some exceptions, but many of them will immediately phone home. Some will take some time to kind of do some recon, figure out where they're at, where they landed, that kind of thing. But eventually, they're going to try to call back. So if you've got your traffic control and interdiction done well, when it tries to call back, it hits this router, and you're like, well, I don't allow that kind of traffic through. And it's going to stop right there. But sometimes it gets through, and hopefully you stop it at your proxy. Worst case, it gets all the way out, and things you have on your perimeter, which is the outside edge, will pick it up when it goes out and potentially when it comes back through. But if it doesn't, then it's going to kind of get free. And at that point, it's going to try to learn what's around it. And that's important to remember, that attackers are blind when they land. So they have the advantage. There's something called the attacker's advantage, because they get to choose the battle. They get to choose the place of conflict, in the sense that they set things up so that they can attack. And in many ways, they get to choose like I said, the field of battle. They get to choose the when and kind of what weapons are going to be employed. So you've got you've got a knife. They come in with a 50 caliber machine gun. They're like, well, I'm sorry, we're going to win. But after you get shot once, you kind of figure out what's going on. That's the sad part. You lose a victim, but you kind of get to recover and move forward. A lot of times that's how network combative back and forth really works. The attacker gets in, and they have to learn the environment in some fashion. And to do that, they don't always have everything they need with them. Generally speaking, they try to come in low and slow and lean, And so they bring in enough to get an entrenchment, a foothold. Sometimes they have a few tools that allow them to look around. Other times they'll use things that are present in the operating system. We call that living off the land, kind of like the physical version of where you go behind enemy lines and you live off the land, right? You basically take from what's present. They do the same thing for malware. There are plenty of built-in administrative tools that allow them to ping a network, see what devices are visible, see what permissions you have, right? They run all those as if they are supposed to be there. That's the whole living off the land concept. Other ones bring tools with them. If they don't have it and they don't use it, so if they don't have it built in and they don't use what's present, what third option must be present then? What must they do?
Create it on the fly.
So difficult, right? To actually compile it, but you're right, that is an option. That's a very small likelihood because it's very difficult to do things like that on the fly. But you're correct in that it is possible to do, and there are some instances where things have been compiled, sent in pieces and recompiled to be useful. But I'm looking for something else. So that's a yes, but I'm looking for a different option. So if you don't use what's there and you didn't bring it with you, what do you have to do?
Have it sent in.
You have to have it sent in. You have to go somewhere and have it pulled in. And that's important because you can isolate out your options now. They either brought it with them, they use what's there, they made it on the fly, or they compiled it from pre-existing code, or they went somewhere and pulled it down. Is there any other options you can think of? Probably not, right? You're probably churning right now going, I don't know if there's any other ones. And you'd be correct. Right now, those are pretty much it. And the reason why I want you to focus on the things that must exist, the things that must happen as a behavioral view is if you don't, what you then have is the 500 vulnerabilities that came out this week that you might have to go through one by one to see if they were present or might be applicable. Or instead, so I don't know if I don't like necessarily using sports references, but I'm going to use one right now. So if you know football or you've played the American version of football, you know that they have defensively, they have zone defense and point defense. And zone defense is what I'm referring to here. Zone defense says, look at an area and defend it regardless of what comes in to that area or what tries to leave it. So zone defense is looking at the behaviors. They had to bring it with them. So now there's traces potentially in the binaries or the files that are part of the infection that you can look for. They're going to use something that is present. Again, they have to call those things. So as they interact with my local tools, I can have a watch on those tools to make sure the right accounts are accessing them and they are accessing them in a way that we would versus they would. Because attackers run very specific combinations with those commands, and they're not always the same ones that we would run as admins. So that takes care of two options. I could put monitoring on those and kind of get a good sense if either one of those happened. Compiling on the fly is very difficult to track and difficult to monitor for. However, if that's not a developer's computer, and I see someone compiling something on the fly, that's a behavior that is out of place and it will stand out because it creates a bunch of what? Artifacts. Every action creates an artifact or leaves an artifact behind, and that will. And the last scenario where it reaches out and pulls things down, that means it has to go to the internet in most instances and pull down files. And everything it pulls down gives me an opportunity to find it. And so you can play zone defense and look for the 4 big behaviors instead of trying to figure out the point defense of what vulnerability got exploited, what new malware came out today, what bad DNS did we maybe detect or not detect, right? Those are exhaustive and very time-intensive ways to try to do the same thing. I'd rather win 99% of the time with zone kind of defense every time. So back to this. So when they land, one of those four things is going to happen. That's why that thought process of what must happen, what must exist is really important. You can use that rubric to figure out what had to have occurred. So we can use it right now in a very simple way. If malware is on that computer, what must have happened? Think about that step. Like something had to have happened if they got malware on their computer.
There had to have been a download or
Okay, so maybe they downloaded something or went to a site, so which would equate to they downloaded something. May have plugged something in, right? Maybe they plugged in a thumb drive, USB drive, an external drive, or maybe they accessed something else on the network, right? You can go through and figure out the behaviors that must have been present and you'll find that once you do that, there's only a few options, right? Downloaded, plug something in, access something that's actually in the network. They bridge the network. What else? Can you think of anything else? They could have made something that turned into malware, right? But not too many more options, right? But the reason I have you think about this is one of those must have happened. And if that happened, there's going to be a trail of artifacts that tie to that behavior. So the simplest one is they downloaded something. So we just spent several slide decks going through DNS. So if they downloaded something, then they had to have done what? Gone to the internet, right? And at that point, we had to figure out how they went to the internet. Did they use a browser? Was it a piece of software they executed? Did somebody call an API, right? You can go through all these options at a very high level and then isolate out the ones that did not happen. And then you have a much narrower scope for your problem, which is to figure out what I have to search for. So if they downloaded something and you look at it and you're like, wow, that is a file for, I don't know, Adobe Photoshop. Then you can go look in your network logs to see, well, did anybody go to a site associated with Adobe Photoshop and find that cracked key generator that they're trying to pull down so they can run their favorite image creating software. Unfortunately, not realizing it's infected. So as analysts, especially intelligence analysts, it's really important for us to keep that framework in mind. It's so simple. It's like a child's framework, but it's so powerful in that you can say something had to have happened, something must have existed for that to be in the place it's at the time it was at. And if that's so, you can go backwards and forwards on what must have happened and what will happen next. And more to come on that. We'll beat that to death because when you combine that with actions leave artifacts, right, or create them, and a few other frameworks, you can really isolate down where most problems are very quickly, and in many cases faster than the security tools. Okay, enough on that. We have much more to go into later. All right, everything's on fire. Yay. I put firewalls, just because we hadn't talked about firewalls. In many cases, they used to be a separate piece of your network, and they are a computer when they do that, but they've kind of become integrated in with just about every bloody router out there. But you put firewalls in key positions because a firewall, there's something to remember. Not every router is a firewall, but every firewall is a router, right? Because router routes traffic for your network, ostensibly to get you to the internet, but it does that. But not every router has an integrated firewall. But every firewall, to do what it does, has to have some kind of routing capacity, because a firewall will close things off or open things up. And by default, that means it has to understand routing. And you position firewalls in places that are key. Generally, they're in the same locations as the routers, as you see, but they can be put alone. They can be put standalone. Like there is a WAF, which is a kind of like a web firewall that you put in front of your websites, or you put in front of the servers that take care of the websites that you may own, so that you can cut down on web access and put a firewall there to cut some things so they don't get to your site at all. And you can think of why, right? Good protection measure. So we're going to talk about these more when we talk about protections and remediation. But for now, just know that firewalls are out there. They can be individual or they can be connected to a router. They're frequently combined these days. You actually, if you have Windows operating system or if you have a Mac device, you have a software firewall that's inside of your operating system. You may not have it on. I kind of hope you do, because its job is just to protect you. Back up one. See all those computers. These are some of the things that you might put on a computer to protect it. It's part of your networking, and every one of these has an impact to the stability and to the amount of traffic on your network. So let's talk about the top one here, the plus. This is the patch management. If you had 10,000 devices in your network, as you can imagine, keeping track of them all is very painful. You don't have a bunch of people checking each device manually saying, hey, are you updated? Are you updated? Oh, there's patches. It's patch Tuesday. Everybody has to get updates. No, you automate that, right? That's one of the first things you do. The domain controller usually plays a part in that, but typically speaking, you cut off and use a different piece of software altogether, and it will have an agent that will go on that computer. And an agent is a piece of software, and just like an agent, it's a proxy of sorts. Its job is to do one thing, hopefully do it really well. And for patch management, its job is to see if you're up to date. And if you're not, queue up patches for those times where you're not using the computer, or when it makes you restart because it has to apply patches, right? So as I believe somebody told me, they don't restart except like once a month or something. So sometimes you need to restart. And there are some things, some updates that can't be done unless you are in that mode. So patch management is really important. And in every enterprise I've worked for, there's an entire team whose sole job is to keep everything as updated as possible. I mean, think about how hard it is to keep your home devices, your phone, your iPad, your computers, your laptops, whatever you've got, updated. Imagine if you had 10, 20, 30, 100, 5 million devices that you're trying to keep updated. And then further have your head hurt when you realize that a third of your population that owns those devices is going to complain when you try to update them and make them safe, because they're like, if you update that, it breaks what I use. So no, you can't update that. And then they make a business case to keep you from updating them to a more secure position. And then another third is just going to do everything they can to keep from having that update occur, because they're traveling, or it's inconvenient, or it's going to impact something they like to do but isn't really necessary. There's lots of reasons why. And so you're going to succeed at 1/3, but 2/3 of your network is going to fight you, which is why every patch management team I've ran into for an enterprise is always angry. Always. They're not the best team to work for, because you're going to be angry all the time, because people will have nonsensical reasons why they don't need to be patched. Yeah. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. So patch management's big. The endpoint agent is like your endpoint defense and response tool. And that's where usually security will put an agent that's set in a way that it's very difficult to turn off. And it's useful in that if malware showed up on the computer, the endpoint detection and response agent could actually act against it. And so if you have Windows 10 or 11, you have Windows Defender. And Windows Defender fits that. It's both antivirus and a endpoint agent. And it can do things to stop malware from executing, for example, if it recognizes it. Those are things that an endpoint does. It also collects data that is useful and so on. There's a lot there. Antivirus does exactly what it says. It just doesn't do it very well. They do their best, but they only may catch between 1/3 and half of the malware that's out there. And it really does vary, and it is very localized to a region. So if we lived in the Eastern European bloc, or maybe over in the Asian area, we might want to use Kaspersky over, say, Symantec. Symantec being a good European product, we want to go there. So there's a little bit of variance there, because they do have a regional influence. That's always important to keep in mind. I put default build on here. I went back and forth, but once you have an enterprise, it probably makes sense that you want to have one version of Windows, right? Your patch management team is nodding really hard right now. They're like, one version. Not, a couple Windows XPs, a couple Windows 7s, maybe some Vista. Oh my goodness, there's one guy who's got Windows ME, right? You don't want that. And you don't want them in varying versions of it either. So you try to have default builds that have operating system updated to the point you can with all the pre-built tools that everybody's going to want in there, and kind of keep that as updated as possible and make everybody adhere to that. That's the whole idea behind a default build. It's one of the best security measures you can put on a computer. It also helps your networking because it unifies everybody into kind of one thing. And you need that, right? It's that way you can also pull out things like, computer games and stuff that shouldn't be installed on a work computer in a work office and so on. Device management is very simply keeping track of all your devices. So one of the biggest problems everybody has, if you have a network, especially a complex one, is you have zero idea what's on your network. You think it'd be simple. You could just ask your routers to tell you what's there, but it's not that simple. It's sometimes very difficult to get a sense of everything that's on your network. And many people will join your network and leave, especially if you have folks who travel or if you have a guest network, right? There's a lot of situations where that can get really complex. A hospital is a very complex network, for example, where devices are joining and leaving networks all the time. So it's very hard to track at a given moment what's really accurately on your network. So having a management tool that helps with that is really important. Group policies is exactly what it sounds like. That domain we talked about, they push these out and it says, all right, everybody, you can't download from, mymalware.com. You cannot do it. It tells you can't. And it also says you can't edit the registry. Naughty, naughty, naughty. You shouldn't be doing that. And it kind of goes down. You can actually put all kinds of stuff in through GPO. The idea is there you create a global policy that goes out to everybody. And lastly, and this is by no means everything, it's just a few things to talk about. Behavior analytics and data loss protection, right? You want to keep the data that's yours. And you want to make sure that you're kind of watching for bad things. Sometimes we get too focused on looking for things in isolation, like malware executed or whatever, but frequently the sequence of events is just as important as the end result. And if you can disrupt the sequence, you can stop something from happening. I could go into that forever, but I'm not. I'm going to pause. So, went dark. Let's stop there. I actually cut it so I would not talk forever. And yes, someone made a point that you can use the group policies to spread malware, specifically ransomware. You absolutely can. You can use so many things. It's very common for different ransomware attackers to, by the time they deploy their ransomware, to use PSExec or another tool that's already there and use a local helpful tool to kind of spread things out. And I see in the chat another great point. You can't necessarily stop people from getting in, but you can make sure they don't get out. And I say that a lot. You are right. And I mean it because it's true. There's a lot of people who take serious amount of pride in being able to break into a network, and that's awesome. The networks are porous. We know this. They're built to be open. We're trying to keep them closed, but they're really built to be very open and talk to anything and everything. And to a certain extent, that's okay. So having an exorbitant amount of pride that you can get into a network seems silly to me, because obviously, right? But can you get out with something is the key part. So if we can't prevent knowing behaviors, if you can't prevent someone getting in, if you can't prevent that from happening, what you need to prevent then is not them being able to do something when they're in the network and being able to leave the network in any fashion. Those are the things that you really want to focus on. But I'll get off and bridge another topic if I'm not careful. So I'm going to stop. Are there any questions or comments that anyone wants to make as we start this kind of introduction into networks and some of the pieces and parts?
In that system that you had, that first router, is that like kind of the pathway that all the other routers go through?
Yes.
Or, okay.
This is the core router. This is the one that's giving you your internet access. So if you're a company, you may have bought a T3 or a T1 line, which is really, you get a lot of bandwidth. So It's like, okay, I've got this huge router that gives me, and it's not physically huge, it has a lot of bandwidth attached to it and a lot of throughput. And you're like, I have this access. Divvying that up so that you have sufficient all the time for critical resources and other things ad hoc is important. And generally you only have one or two. I think the most I've seen on a network was 4. It was an incredibly complex network and they had 4 different connections. So generally that's the choke point. And we talked about that last time. You always want to identify choke points because what might you want to do? You might want to monitor there, right? And observe.
Right.
But if you put too much on the router, if you like overwork the router, it doesn't get a chance to route and it gets slow. Nobody likes a slow internet connection. So typically you put something either in front of it or behind it. And by that, in front would be in between it and in the internet, behind it would be between it and the network. Good question.
And the proxy functions kind of as to not let people know that like you're, I don't know, in Cleveland, you know, at this address or whatever, right? Or
it can do
is it-
that. In this instance, in an enterprise, that proxy is to make sure that everything inside the network gets anonymized properly and to act as a speed bump. You know what you do with a speed bump, you put them on roads to slow people down. So sometimes you want to have a speed bump in the process of people doing downloads or accessing certain online resources so that you have a chance to think, you have a chance to do something about it. And you might do caching on the proxy so that you only request something once, preserve your bandwidth, and just feedback the cached version. All kinds of things you can do with a proxy. It serves a purpose to try to make your network more efficient. It's also a security purpose because you can then filter there and not allow some things to go out of your network and then throw an alarm when you see them. Go ahead. Good question so far.
That's what I have for the system. So the other routers just kind of are serving to separate and separate kind of groupings.
Sure. Remember, they're traffic cops, they're controllers. So, like this router might say nothing gets to the domain controller unless it's these 2 IP addresses. So nobody in the network or outside the network can get through this router except for those 2 IPs, let's say. But the domain controller can talk out as much as it wants. You could do that, right? You can do all those kind of things at each one of these routers. That's why they're there. Like you might say this router on the far left here might say nobody can see me. None of the rest of the network is allowed to see my 5 computers, but my 5 computers can see everybody that it can see, right? You can set up all kinds of rules. And that's really important because when you hear malware or a vulnerability or something is aimed at a certain part of the network, you can visualize how a network is probably structured and go, okay, this is why this may or may not be a threat that we should observe. Part of what I'm leading up to, since you're kind of doing really well, is you need to know how, as a team and as an analyst, when to say a threat is really a threat that you should pay attention to. And it's all very contextual to where you work and what you're trying to do. And so you need to have a nomination process in your mind, one that you can use over and over, that says, this is how I determine that something is a threat and when something isn't. So if you had this kind of network as an example, and you saw 5 vulnerabilities come out tomorrow about virtualized networks, VM software, but you don't use VM software, your threat nomination process would go, I don't need to worry about that. That's concerning, but I'm not at risk. It's not a threat to me. Now you might say, well, I do use it in one of my, let's say these are all virtualized. You're like, well, I do use that virtualized software here. Maybe that is a threat to me. I'll nominate it and then evaluate it. And you might evaluate it and say, well, even though this segment of my network uses that software, and yes, it is vulnerable to the attack, I have it partitioned so that nothing from the outside can interact with them. So now you would lower the priority of handling that threat. That's why knowing how networks are kind of arranged from an intelligence analyst perspective in cybersecurity is really important, because it helps you put that in context. You need to know enough to be dangerous and know enough to actually figure out how things are probably architected, to ask the smart questions to make sure that it is set up the way you think it is.
How often are networks actually set up properly like this?
Every time. I've never, ever in 30 plus years seen a network that looks like its network diagram. There's always things wrong because people are there.
Oops.
Well, I mean, people are your greatest asset and your biggest problem. And we'll attach our phone and bridge, networks that we shouldn't. We'll bring in devices that, we're staying up all night because we're working from 1 in the morning to 11 in the morning. So we'll bring in an extra laptop into our workspace. Internet will fall out, and because we need to deliver something, we'll connect a hotspot into our office, hardware in ways we shouldn't, or connect it to our home router, right? There's all kinds of reasons why this might occur, and many of them legitimate, but they are risks that cause threats to happen. Right? You could buy a smart printer that's like, hey, I need to go check to see if I have updates, but that very process, might open an attack vector to allow somebody to bring malware in. So good questions, all good questions. So I'll make a few points then before I close this. I said earlier, malware is kind of blind. So when an attacker gets in, whether they come in through malware or they come in because they bought their way in, or they scanned and they found something that's vulnerable, which is a concept that we are going to talk about on how that happens. Like somebody on the very outside of your network figures out what the inside of your network looks like, because that's something that attackers do regularly as a reconnaissance item. They're like, what does the network look like? Even if it's 80% wrong, even if it's 50% wrong, they get ideas on what's there. And we frequently bleed that information out. When we get into the functional days, I'm going to show you, we're going to do some of that. We'll do reconnaissance in a non-intrusive way, in a passive way, so that you can pick up some of the things that we as companies kind of tell the attackers is present. Like I might tell them what router I use, so they can go research to see if there's a vulnerability on it. I might tell them what kind of proxy I have installed. And you might be thinking, well, why would I do that? Why, that sounds silly. Why would I tell the person who's going to attack me what weapons I use? And oh, by the way, hey, I'm not watching the back door from 1 to 4. If you're going to attack, that's a great window, right? You don't want to do those things, but we kind of do accidentally and on purpose. And it's frustrating, but it's part of how business works. So it's hard to do this without doing a functional, but when we get into the functional day, I'll show you how that happens. Sometimes it's the dumbest things, like I need a new network engineer. So you write a job description that has all your technology in it.
Oh no.
And so you're like, wow. And now if you're trying to get a job and you're looking at that and you're like, wow, I got to learn all these different things. But if I'm an attacker, I'm like, you don't have an engineer and you use Sophos and you use Sophos Intercept. Okay. It looks like you got some Python and some Go going, and you have a couple other technologies that you list, and you're like, okay, check. I have an idea what's probably in the network now. And now let's think about all the ways to figure that out and verify it. And someone made a point, they've seen them even drop version numbers. Yes, absolutely. And some devices will respond in ways and tell you what they are too. I mean, so that's where the functional part will be fun, because you can probe these things and you'll see that they kind of make announcements like, hey, I'm an open FTP and I am this version. Come take advantage of me.
Oops.
Yeah. So I was trying not to get on a roll there. The other thing is really remember, though, that if you pay attention to what must happen and what must exist, and you think behaviors and you play zone with a lot of things, then many of these things we're talking about can be thwarted in good ways very easily. It just requires a little bit of work. And you may, if you can create a good relationship with your IT department and get them to trust you, your job will be much easier. But it takes some work to do that. That's probably one of the biggest struggles I see in enterprises, because it's been done so badly. Often you walk into a situation where there's an antagonistic kind of relationship. Patch team's overworked and harried, and they don't want to hear you saying they have to move a patch up because they're on a patch cycle and they get 30 days to patch. I hear this all the time. I got 30 days to do that patching. I'm like, well, it's being abused right now, but I got 30 days to patch this. Right. And they're not wrong because they're looking at their schedule and they're like, I have 10 million devices to patch. I need time. But if you can make it, if you have a solid nomination and prioritization process worked out for threats, then the few times you bring up the fact that, hey, this needs to be patched now, not 30 days from now, can make the difference between them having an incident or not. And if they have trust in your process and are a stakeholder in it, right, they know it and they've bought into it, then you'll find that they will work with you really well. And I've seen that happen in a few places. I've seen it mostly not happen because it's very difficult to get trust. Yeah. And someone made a point that average patch time for a lot of 0 days was like 90 to 107 days. That's all because of business needs. I'll give you a couple of key examples as a kind of a closer for that. Let's say it's a hospital again, since they're my favorite subject. Priority patch comes out. There's active abuse against a particular product. But the problem is that product is attached to somebody keeping them alive. You can't turn it off to patch it. You can't shift it to patch it because you don't have excess resources to offload. This happened during COVID a lot. You cannot patch that. Now, if this was that machine, this was the machine right here you couldn't patch, and you know it's vulnerable, the answer isn't, get on your knees and pray, because that ain't going to help you in this instance. The answer here is, do smart things, then go pray. But, just do smart things first, in the sense that if I can't patch this and it's vulnerable, let me put something between it and the internet so that I know it's secure, right? You secure around it. It is the smartest answer for that kind of problem. And it doesn't matter what it is. I have something, I cannot update or patch it. It's vulnerable, it's old, it's whatever. Great. I can put more modern things in front of it or around it in order to secure it, or at least know when it has a problem so I can offload or do something else, right? There is always an answer. And that's part of getting IT to trust you. I think I'm going to stop there. So if there's no more questions, I'm going to end the recording and we'll have free time for a few minutes.
No more questions. Thank you very much.
Hold on. End the recording.